Good morning, bom dia. My name is Cristine Severo. I will chair this presentation today. It's my honor and great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker, who knows Brazil a lot, que conhece bastante o Brasil, Professor Arthur Spears, a longtime resident of Harlem in the Manhattan borough of New York City, is Presidential Professor of Linguistics and Anthropology Emeritus at the City University of New York. His residency has deeply affected his understanding of white supremacist racism and colorism as they affect lived experience outside and inside the academy. He specializes in race, language, and culture, as well as grammatical description focused on African American English and Pidgin and Creole languages, Haitian Creole in particular. The title of his inspiring talk today, and powerful one, is Race, Language, Culture, and Grammar in the Life of a Black University Professor. Professor Arthur, many thanks for your virtual presence here today. Please, now the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you for that introduction, Christine. And it's a pleasure for me to give this talk today because as we were chatting before, Brazil is my favorite country. Doing this brings back lots of memories. So today I decided to break my talk into two parts, and I have lots more material than I can cover, but I'm going to go through the highlights. And if you want any elaborations, you can just ask me about it. So the first part of the talk is my life and career. I was asked to talk about that. And the second part is my life in the academy. Okay, so beginning with the first part, my life and career. Um, when you get to a certain age, you become a living history book because you've been around and you see how the media distort history, for one thing. So let me tell you, I grew up in a multi-class Black ghetto. And some people don't like the term ghetto, but a ghetto is what it was. We were confined. There was rigid, apartheid-like segregation. And most of the time, we did not go outside of the Black ghetto, and whites did not come inside. The only time whites came inside the Black ghetto was when they were driving through on traffic ways. And traffic ways were the early version of freeways. And I lived on a traffic way, so I could see whites driving past, but that's basically the only contact. So let me tell you what the Black ghetto was like, because it's very important in my formation. As I said, it was totally segregated. All of the public institutions and local businesses were Black, completely Black. So in the school that I went to, the principal, the teachers, the janitors and custodians, the counselors, the librarian, everybody was Black. We never saw white people in our school, except maybe once a year or once every 2 years. The superintendent, the white superintendent, who was over all of the city schools, would come to visit our Black high school. They never visited any school of ours except the high school. Now, let me say something. The Black high school was an excellent school. It was as good or better than the private schools. And that's probably very surprising. Why would a school in a Black ghetto be better than most of even the private schools? Well, what happens is that it was multi-class, first of all, so everyone lived there, from the most wealthy Black family to the poorest Black family. We all lived there. It was multi-class. The second thing is that teaching jobs, government jobs, were the best jobs that Black people could get. So the best and the brightest were high school teachers. So Obama and Oprah Winfrey and Michelle Obama, all of them would have been high school teachers back in those days. So you can imagine the kinds of teachers that we had. They were larger than life, big personalities, incredibly brilliant people. And also they were all always very well dressed, very well turned out, because they were the ones in the community who had the money to dress well. And they always drove nice new cars. So we looked up to teachers. It's not like nowadays when people look down on teaching because it's not a very prized profession. We had excellent language instruction. We were required to speak the language. If you didn't speak the language, you could not pass the course. So I took French, but actually I grew up speaking French because I learned it at home. So when I got to high school, they said, you have to take the first French course. And I said, I already speak French. And they said, we've never heard of such a thing, a Black high school student who speaks French. We've never heard of such a thing. You take the first course. So I took the first French course and I just sat there and listened to the teacher. Sometimes he made mistakes, but basically he was good. And he was very good at teaching the students French. I lived near the boundary, the frontier, the border of the Black ghetto. So I saw whites, and I'll have to amend what I said before. I saw whites, but they were a block from me. And sometimes I would go up that way to the very edge to visit friends. And I would see white kids my age, but I never talked to them. I didn't know their names. I didn't know anything about them, but I just saw them. They saw me. We would look at each other. We never said anything to each other. It was very interesting. They were poor, very poor whites who were mostly immigrants from the South. And they spoke non-standard English. The middle class and upper class white neighborhoods were far from us. So we lived next, the border of the Black ghetto was next to the very poor white community. So to tell the truth, we looked down on whites because they were poor. The ones we saw were poor and often dirty, and they spoke non-standard English. So it was a very strange situation, counter to expectations. I just want to put that in. The other thing I want to mention, and as I said, I'll only be able to mention some things, is that contrary to popular opinion, we had Black institutions and Black businesses. Virtually all the businesses in the Black ghetto were Black owned and operated. The bank, the laundry, the bakery, restaurants. We even had a Black university and a Black hospital because we could not go to the white hospitals. So we built our own. And the university, it made it a lot easier for us to study. So a university had been founded around the turn of the century, 1900. Okay. So we had all of those things and they were Black owned. We had Black nightclubs, restaurants, and so on and so forth. So what I want to say is African Americans are very entrepreneurial, but this is denied by the media. The media talks about Black communities as though Black people don't know anything about business. My family became entrepreneurs right after slavery, and they've been entrepreneurs up to the present, but this is denied. It's the Black community is talked about in a way that does not correspond to reality. I want to see what I want to focus on. You also have to understand, and I just want to make a couple of points about that overall situation with Black ghettos, is that often Black property was either stolen by whites or there was what I call asset infringement. And infringement means they use your assets illegally, and there's nothing you can do about it because the law is on the side of the whites. So my family's property was stolen, much of my family property, for the last 150 years. From time to time, it was stolen. And you probably heard of lynching in the United States. And these were extrajudicial murders of Blacks, sometimes Jews, sometimes Catholics, but mostly Blacks. And they were usually connected with confiscating assets. Okay, so that's a very important point to bring up. The last thing I'll say is that growing up, I always wanted to get out of the ghetto. So growing up, I could not wait until I left. I wanted to get out. It was like a prison. And also it just so happens that my family was like a prison. I always felt imprisoned in the family because I was very independent. And I felt imprisoned in the ghetto. So the moment I could get out and start traveling, boom, I was gone. So I went to France. I finally got out, and I didn't go to Chicago. I didn't go to New York. I went directly to Paris. Didn't go to St. Louis. That's a smaller city on the Mississippi River. And had a wonderful time. While I was traveling in Europe, I met James Baldwin. I have to tell this story. Are Brazilians generally familiar with James Baldwin? I would imagine. I met James Baldwin in Heathrow Airport. And I was in the bar. We were having drinks before a flight to Amsterdam. And I looked over and there was James Baldwin. And I said to the white friend next to me, who I was traveling with, "There's James Baldwin." And he said, "Who's James Baldwin?" So I said, "Excuse me, I'm going to go over and say hello." I went over and said hello to James Baldwin. He was very friendly, and he said, "How are you?" So we started talking and laughing, talking about everything. We talked for about 45 minutes. I had James Baldwin all to myself in Heathrow Airport in the bar. So I always like to tell that story. I went to college and I majored in French, Spanish, and international relations because I figured I was going to be abroad, so why not study international relations? In college, I had to learn how to be successful as a Black student. Let me tell you some of the strategies. One of the things I learned in college is that white American professors refused to give Black students A's. But I was lucky. You know why? I had 2 foreign language majors, French and Spanish, and most of the professors were foreign. All of our professors were white, but the foreign white professors were willing to give Black students A's. So that's how I was able to graduate with honors, because most of my courses were with white foreign professors. We had study clubs. Students would study together. And since the university was 99% white, there were hardly ever any Black students in my classes. So who was I going to study with? Because everybody did it, and that's the way you learned the material better. So I learned through trial and error that there were some students who were more open, who were more liberal. And who were those students? Foreign students, of course, because they hadn't learned American racism, but also hippies and counterculture, white American students. And there was another group of students who were very friendly and that we Black students socialized with, and those were Jews. Okay. The relationship with Jews and Blacks in the United States has been different from that between Blacks and Gentiles. And I could talk for a day about that, but I want to point that out. So the Black students were friendly with Jewish students. The amount of anti-Semitism in the Midwestern United States was extreme. Sometimes I thought they hated Jews as much as they hated Blacks. It was difficult to tell the difference. So Jews sympathized with us, we sympathized with them. Now, I went on a Fulbright grant study to South America after I graduated from college. So I spent about a year and a half in South America, and that's where I discovered Brazil. Eu descobri o Brasil. And I also spent some time in Chile and in Argentina. And I could talk for days about the differences in the racial situations in those countries. One of the interesting things about Latin America, because I've been to most of the countries, is that I encountered basically no racial prejudice among the poorer classes and the lower middle classes, the clases humildes, as they say in Spanish. The only discrimination, and it was very clear, is in the Latin American upper classes, who are all white. So I would meet them as an American and being a foreigner, but that's the only group in Latin America that I really felt strong prejudice from. And of course, there are historical reasons for that, and I don't need to go into that. Now, I want to make sure. Okay. So I went to graduate school when I came back from living in Uruguay. My Fulbright study grant was in Uruguay. And of course, Montevideo is right across from Buenos Aires. So I went there quite a bit. I went to Chile for the summer to take some summer courses. When I was in Montevideo, there was a big student strike at the university. So we didn't have any classes. We couldn't study because the university was closed. So several of us in Montevideo went to Brazil, and that was my first trip to Brazil, and that's when I discovered Brazil. And that was around Carnival time. And Carnival was so totally amazing. I had never, even in my imagination, conceptualized anything so I lack words. So filling for the senses. So of course I learned to Samba. My Brazilian friends taught the Americans to Samba. And I remember there was a chant that year. I think it was 1962. No, it would have been 1965. No, 66, beginning of the year. And I remember the chant was, eu vou pra Xingulá, eu vou pra Xingulá. And people would go through the streets doing the chant or singing the Samba song for that year, and I can't remember the Samba song for that year. As a matter of fact, it may have, Eu Vou Pra Xingulá may be the lyrics to the Samba song for that year. But anyway, we had a great time. I learned a lot. I had taken a course in Portuguese in Montevideo because I knew I was going to go to Brazil. And I remember learning the future subjunctive. Se você for. Um, and I said, oh, this is very interesting. So I guess I probably won't hear it because it's probably a form that's only used by the elites. And the first day I got there, I saw a lady sitting on the sidewalk. She was very poor. She wasn't begging, she was selling things. And she used the future subjunctive. And by the end of the day, I saw that everybody uses the future subjunctive. I thought it was a very archaic form. And what I was fascinated because I've always been interested in tense aspect and mood. And for some strange reason, I started hanging out with German Brazilians. They live in the South, Santa Catarina. And I had studied German. So for some reason, we became very friendly and we went everywhere together. And one day I said something, and in all of the clauses, I used present subjunctives. Espero que podamos sair antes de que a chuva comece. And she said, oh no. And I said, what's wrong with that? And she said, espero podermos sair antes da chuva começar. And I said, you can use all of those infinitive mood phrases in succession? And she said, yes, that's the normal way to say it. I was totally fascinated, and I've been hooked on Portuguese grammar ever since. We don't have anything in any of the languages I have studied. Every language I have studied, there's nothing like the infinitive mood and also the future subjunctive. So they were particularly interested in my specialty as tense mood and aspect. Okay, let's go on to my career at the university. Actually, I have a little time. One of the things that, and I'll say this to wrap up the part where I talk about my life, is one of the effects of growing up in a ghetto is that people become very insular and they don't look outside. So many of the friends that I grew up weren't so interested in traveling and seeing the world and getting to know white people. When I first went to college, I left the ghetto to go to the primarily white university. I felt like an anthropologist. I was very interested in learning about white people. What are they like? I've heard so much about them. I've seen them on television. What are they like? It's like going to the Amazon. And I've heard about the peoples of the Amazon, the indigenous peoples. What are they like? What do they speak like? So I had that sort of anthropological interest in whites because we didn't grow up with them. But most Black students were more insular. And I found that my outward orientation served me well because in making friends, and sometimes I was rebuffed, but other times I wasn't. If I was rebuffed or not accepted, I didn't care. That was just my personality. I'll try. And if you throw rocks at me, I'll catch the rocks and throw them back at you. It's my personality. So I think it's important for students who come from marginalized and subordinated groups, even though there are difficulties, to try to push and go outside of their home communities in order to discover that world. And of course, in the case of subordinated groups such as Black Americans, it's the whites who control the resources of the society. So we have to get to know them in order to interact with them. in pursuing my own interests, our own interests. And that's something that I've always told my students in classes. I've had lots of Black American and Black Caribbean students in my classes at the City University of New York. Now, the second part of my talk, and I'm running a little behind, I'm going to speed up, is about the academy. And so I'll say something about the politics of theory and methodology in the academy. And my examples are going to come primarily from linguistics, which is my primary discipline. I got my third job in an anthropology department, and that was where I was for most of my career, over 30 years. Throughout my career, I was able to do the kind of research I wanted to. Now, why is that important? Most people think, doesn't everybody do the research they want to do? Well, no. Here's the situation. We have categories of universities. R1, that means research one, which means very high level of research. And then we have R2 and R3 and so on and so forth. I was at an R1 university. All of the universities that you've heard of, like Stanford and Harvard and Princeton and the University of Michigan and so on and so forth, they're R1 universities. Now, what's the problem with doing the kind of research you want to do? If you're in the social sciences particularly, you're expected to get grants and bring money into the university. Certain specialties are not good for grants. I wanted to study African American English, which is the language that I grew up with. Most people who study African American English study it from a Lebovian, quantitative, variationist perspective. So Lebov, who is a very nice person, I've known him throughout my career, and he's been very supportive. But he is, nevertheless, the great white master of Black American language studies. And his being white and also brilliant got him into that position. So practically all of the Black Americans who study Black language are Lebovians. In other words, they're quantitative sociolinguistics, variationists. I wanted to study African American English from another point of view. Many people studied Native American languages where I was in graduate school at the University of California, San Diego. So I came in contact in graduate school with people who approach languages holistically. We want the broadest possible description of this language and as deep as possible before the language disappeared. So I was always surrounded by that perspective, learning everything you can about the language. In other words, creating a theory of the language. And as you know, indigenous language grammars are quite different from anything we've experienced with European languages. So without even realizing it, I brought that perspective to the study of my own language background. We call it African American English. But it was not a recognizable or legitimate way to study it. If you're going to study African American English or a stigmatized, largely stigmatized language variety, you were expected to study it from a variationist perspective. Okay, so in that way, I was bucking the trend. I was going against the grain. But I did it because that's what I wanted to do. You know, linguists do not become rich and famous. So in Brazil, yes, you do. But in the United States, the linguists do not become rich and famous. So I figured you have to do what you love to do. That's what you get out of it. It's what you love to do. So I studied what I wanted to do. but it means I did not get grants. Okay, it just so happened I was in an anthropology department and I was a linguist. So the anthropologists were not telling me what I should be doing. Also, it was a department and a college within the university where grant getting was not the be all and end all of a university career. So I was very fortunate in that I could do the research I wanted to do and not follow specializations, in other words, theories and methodologies that were highly prized and highly recognizable. If someone sees you at a reception and says, "What do you do?" I have to talk for 2 minutes to tell them what I do. But if you say, "I'm a variationist," you only have to use one word and everybody knows your whole story. You do variation, sociolinguistics, you apply for grants, and if you do it correctly, you'll get very big grants, and the university will be very happy and you will get your promotions. Fortunately, as I said, I was not at an R1 university where I had to do that. So I was able to be happy doing the kind of research I wanted to do. And as I said, I wanted to research and create a theory of African American English. And when you look at a language holistically, it's not just about grammar. It's also about communicative practices. It's about the culture of the language, culture of the people who speak the language. It's about their social condition. It's about their social history. It's about their economics, because guess what? All of those things show up in the language. Race shows up in the language. History shows up in the language. Slave oppression shows up in the language. Now, most linguists would probably say that's hard to believe. But if you study a language deep enough, you see that there are things that can be explained only with reference to social and cultural factors. And race comes into it too. Now, I'm going to make some points about being a person of color or from a minority group in the academy. And if I have some time, I'll give you some examples of what I was talking about. There's always racial discrimination, and it was very heavy at the university I was at. And I would not single out that university because it's present everywhere. But as I look back over my career, I have found that it's hard, number one, to organize people, any kind of people, junior professors, Black professors, professors of color, because, believe it or not, there is so much fear. People are afraid of displeasing administrators because they're afraid of losing their jobs. It's perfectly rational to want to keep your job. That's perfectly rational. But what I found is that the high level of fear was irrational. And people did not even try to speak up for their rights. If they were turned down for tenure or for a promotion, they accepted that and didn't file a grievance. Now, I'm proud to report that I was turned down for tenure multiple times. I was turned down for every promotion. I was turned down for a special off-scale above full professor promotion. I was turned down for all of those things. I am proud to report because of my willingness to speak out and also my willingness to file grievances. And what I learned is this. Now, let me tell you something as an aside. I was absolutely dumbstruck by the discrimination against women. During the latter part of my career, I sat on personnel and budget committees, which handle promotions. I knew that there was discrimination, but I had no idea of the level of gender discrimination. So what I'm talking about now applies to women as a class, and also people of color, and also other classes. This is what I learned. You're damned if you do, and damned if you don't. That's an old saying in English, and it applies to the university situation. You're damned if you do speak out and stand up for your rights, because some administrators will try to stop your career. Some will do that, not all. And you're damned if you don't speak out and stand up for your rights, because what happens? You do not rise, you do not get the promotions. One of the things I found out after I had been at the university for a while is that the great majority of women and professors of color never make it to full professor. Very few make it to full professor. And they went along and got along. That's an expression we have. To go along and get along, that means to keep your head down, don't speak out. Okay, be a little servile to those who are higher up. But they never made full professor. So you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. The price I paid for trying to organize groups of professors and speaking out and so on and so forth is that it took me longer to get my promotions, because I had to make sure that my file was in top shape. In other words, my file had so much in it that if I were denied a promotion, I could file a lawsuit. Okay, so I had to wait to that point. I did that. I got my promotions and I got to full professor. Very few of those in the groups I talked about got to full professor. So I feel that in the end, you're better off when you fight against discrimination. You're better off in the end. You may get a short-term victory by kowtowing to power, but it's only short-term. Kowtow is an interesting word. Are you familiar with the word kowtow? It comes from what vassals used to do before the Chinese emperor. They prostrated themselves on the floor, and that's kowtow. It's the most extreme form of bowing. So when we talk about being servile before power, that's kowtowing, the most extreme form of it. Okay. No one ever does that in Brazil, so you aren't familiar with that concept. Okay. I'm going to try to show you the example now. So I'm going to go to share screen. And now what I have to do is share the screen I want. Now I've got the screen I want, and I'm going to click share. Hey, that was pretty easy, wasn't it? Okay. Now, what I'm going to do with these examples is back up my claim that you cannot fully understand the language unless you understand the society, culture, and history surrounding it. And the first example is of the word empty out. And empty out is not on the screen, but I don't need the screen for that. Empty out is like you can empty out a box, you can empty out a suitcase, but empty out has a medical sense in African American English. And what it means is to have a hysterectomy performed on a woman against her will. So African American English has a special term for that. And the question is, why would African American English have a special vernacular term for a forced hysterectomy? Because throughout African American history, Black women were forced to have hysterectomies against their will. They would go to the hospital because they had the flu, and they would perform a hysterectomy on the Black women. And I was once told about a 16-year-old girl who went to the hospital because she had the flu and she wanted to get some medication. And they tricked her into going into the hospital. And while there, they put her under sedation and performed a hysterectomy. She was 16. Can you imagine what it's like to have that done? It essentially, I don't have to explain what it means because you know. African American English has a special term for a hysterectomy being performed on a woman against her will or without her knowledge. And in learning about that particular lexical item, you learn a lot about race and terror and violence in African American history. Let's go to another example. If any of you are familiar with the Navajo language by chance, you will know that there is something called an animacy hierarchy. And you have to know Navajo organic philosophy that we find outside of the university in order to understand the hierarchy. But the hierarchy is part of grammar. It governs the order of nouns and the structure of the clause in the Navajo language. Now, if you don't know that there's a animacy, inanimacy hierarchy, then the structure of the Navajo clause seems to be hopelessly chaotic, haphazard. It makes no sense. But once you know about Navajo culture and organic philosophy, then you become aware of the animacy, inanimacy hierarchy. And the grammar of the Navajo clause becomes totally transparent. Okay, so that's the example that lots of people know about of how culture and society and history are so important in understanding grammar. We have something like that in African American English, and I'll give you a quick example. You'll see these, if you can see my cursor, see the three sentences here. Look at that yellow, look at that black, look at that brown skin. Okay, we have something interesting. You can say, look at that yellow, and then it's followed by a negative word or curse word or anything like that. So you can say, and I'll use the same word in each example sentence, look at that Yela idiot. You know, you're mad at somebody and they're yellow, in other words, light skin. You can say that. Look at that yellow idiot. People say it all the time. Suppose someone is very dark skinned. You can say, look at that black idiot. Okay, in both cases, you're saying something negative and expressing disapproval about someone. Well, strangely enough, you cannot say, look at that brown-skinned idiot. Or look at that tan idiot. You cannot use any term in that context that basically refers to brown or tan or in the middle skin coloring. Yellow, light skin, black, very dark skin. You can do it to express disapproval, indignation, etc. And I had always thought that that was very strange. Why can't you do that? And then I thought about the ideology of skin color within the African American community, which explains what's going on. Yela can be used as a term of abuse. Why? Because there's a part of the African American worldview that rejects yellowness because yellowness signifies white ancestry and closeness to whiteness, where all the historical abuse has come from. Now, what about black? Well, we know that wherever there is oppression, long term, that there is internalized oppression among those who are oppressed. This is true of all people who have been oppressed for a long time. So you can use black for a very negative statement about somebody, along with yellow. So yellow is rejecting closeness to whiteness. Okay. It's resistance to white supremacy in an indirect way. And blackness is expressing, blackness is expressing, excuse me, I got it backwards. Blackness is expressing acceptance, okay, of white supremacist ideology. Black, far from white, bad. Okay, so worthy of abuse. Yellow can be used, and it's expressing rejection of yellowness or rejection of closeness to whiteness, and by extension, rejection of white supremacy. Brown is sort of in a never land. It's in the middle. It does not get caught up in that ideological tug of war, that ideological opposition. But yellowness, closeness to whiteness, and blackness, distance from whiteness, do get completely caught up in those ideological oppositions. And we can explain with reference to the history of African Americans and color politics or colorism within the African American community, the grammar that governs how these expressions work. So that's a simple example that's comparable to what's going on in Navajo. So what does this relate to? And I'll just say this and end here. This relates to the fact that to really get to know a language, to get to understand its grammar in depth, we have to take into account society and culture. And of course, racism is part of culture. Misogyny is part of culture. All of those things are part of culture. And we can expect to find them in the grammar of the language of people who have had those experiences. So with that, I'll end my talk, and I hope I haven't gone too long over time. I don't know how you want to handle the questions, but I'm here.
Many thanks, Professor Arthur. What an inspiring talk, what an inspiring presentation. There are many people on the chat saying hello, bom dia. It's so nice to hear from you. People from different parts in Brazil. And also our colleague Cliff is here saying interesting trajectory. So many people saying hello to you and giving congratulations as well. And,
I don't see my chat. My chat has not come up. I have the chat on, but I don't see anything in it, which is strange. Because all of the messages should show up in my chat screen, right?
wow. Yes, Peter Jones is saying good day to everyone. Bom dia, hello. Professor Arthur, could you, I don't know, from your experience in Brazil, could you say something about the idea of an African Brazilian Portuguese? Is it possible to compare like African American English and African Brazilian Portuguese? Do you think we can find similarities or comparable issues related to both language practices?
Let me say this. I've heard the term and I've been aware of the concept. Brazil is different from the United States. Surprise. This is what I think. That to the extent, and this is in any country, and then I'll come back to Brazil, to the extent there is racial or skin color segregation, distinct varieties of the language will arise. My impression is that there are pockets in Brazil of concentrated Blackness. Some of the favelas I've seen, not all, but some in different cities, I would say that there could arise a Portuguese. I have not seen any descriptions of it. So I have nothing to go on from a grammatical or ethnographic point of view, but people do mention it. And for the time being, I take their word. But the key issue is, do you find segregated or largely segregated living conditions for dark-skinned Brazilians such that there would be a community, a Black community in Brazil that would develop a distinct variety of Brazilian Portuguese, as has developed in the United States? I would tend to think that it would be hard to back up the claim that there is a Portuguese and that there would be significant numbers of lighter skinned and even white Brazilians, because there are white Brazilians in the favelas, that they would speak the Portuguese too. Okay. But it may be primarily a Black thing. Okay. But there would be others that speak it due to the fact that even the poorest areas are skin color integrated, or if you want to use a term, racially integrated. So is that a clear response? Does that come through clearly?
Yes, thanks a lot. And Sibusiso Cliff, he says, please comment on how different is this perspective from the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis or any other forms of cultural determination?
Okay, I see the question in the chat now, so I want to read it. Differences from the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is basically that the language you speak has an effect on how you think. And there's been a lot of research on this, and the Whorf, as we say Sapir-Whorf because Sapir came up with it first. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis was operationalized. And in other words, it was broken down logically by Joshua Fishman. He did a very important service. And he said, let's operationalize the hypothesis, make it empirical. Okay, because an empirical statement is testable, it's falsifiable. So he operationalized it by saying, does this hypothesis mean that the language you speak determines the way you think? Or does it mean that it influences the way you speak? So it's a difference between determine and influence. Now, it's clear that the language you speak influences the way you speak, but no one has been able to come up with proof that it in any way determines what you think. So that's pretty much a summary of the literature on that. But I would say this, the language you speak, particularly if you speak one, is, we would say informally, hellishly. Have you heard that expression? It's hellishly important in the way you think. So we have to keep that in mind, but it doesn't determine it. You can think outside of that box that your native language creates. Most of the world is multilingual, not bilingual, multilingual. So we have to take that into consideration too. How do those several languages that one person speaks interact? And so the hypothesis becomes very difficult in terms of proof in those multilingual situations.
Professor Arthur, taking your personal experience as an example, in your opinion, what is the role of white scholars in the anti-racist struggles in the context of higher education?
There's no one role. White scholars in different situations, they have different skills, different everything. And any individual, not just white scholars, has to look at their situation to figure out how they can best help. But one thing is always important. If you are a member of a higher group in the hierarchy, if you're a male versus a female, if you're straight versus gay or lesbian, if you're a Christian versus Muslim, etc. If you are higher in that hierarchy, and this includes whites who are higher in the racial hierarchy, you have assimilated, whether you know it or not, racist or misogynist or Islamophobic ideas. So number one, you have to do self-work. You have to work on yourself to root out those racist ideas or those misogynist ideas. See, I want to expand the discussion. It's just not simply about race. Race is central, but it's not about race alone. So, and when I'm teaching this to white students, I say, I have things to work on. And I have to ask myself, where does misogyny lie within my mind, and what can I do to root it out, to get rid of it? The second thing, in addition to looking at yourself and rooting out those negative ideas you have, the second thing is learning about the other group. Whites know so little, generally, almost universally, about the Black experience. You cannot understand the Black experience because nobody writes about it in a way that you can comprehend it. There is so much that Black people have gone through that 99.9% of white people know nothing about. They have no concept of what Black people have dealt with. Okay. Just as men have no concept of what it's like to find yourself in a situation and getting raped. From the normal male point of view, that's impossible to conceptualize. Okay. And in the same way, a white person trying to conceptualize what Black people have gone through, it takes work. It takes reading, it takes talking to people, it takes joining groups. So there are two very clear things that can be done. Number one, work on yourself, look inside of yourself and see what negative ideas you are harboring. Okay. And then secondly, learn about the groups who do not have the privilege that you have. And those two things are very important. I've talked to people, whites here and there, usually working class people, and they'll say something that's racist or that distorts what the Black community is about. And I have found if I don't get angry and simply give them the history that they need to understand, most of the times they will say, oh, I didn't know that. And they're stopped in their tracks and they have to stop and think. Now, this doesn't happen all the time. We have to realize that at the bottom of everything, there are interests. Males have interests vested in male supremacy. Whites have interest vested in white supremacy. Why? Because of the privilege that it gives you, and people do not want to give up their privilege in most cases. So even well-meaning whites will say, I want to help, but they have a bottom line. I'm not willing to give up my privilege. So the question becomes, can you really help if you're not willing to give up some of your white privilege? Can you really help at the end of the day? And that's the hard question that nobody wants to ask. I'll ask it and say, you have to be willing to give up some of your white privilege, because that's what racial equality or increasing racial equality means, that you give up some of your privilege. And I sometimes say jokingly when the topic comes up, where's my award? You may look at my curriculum vitae and think, well, it's nice, but it's not that spectacular. And I say, well, listen, I did this while I was Black. I'm white now, but I did all of this stuff on my vita when I was Black. And I want an award for having been able to do that as a Black person. What could you have done if you were Black? And I think that's a question that all whites have to ask. What could I have done if I had been Black? And then when I'm angry with somebody who has said something very not nice, I say, what would you be if you had been Black? If you hadn't had white privilege accompanying you throughout your life? Okay, so that's it. I could talk all day, but I have to stop.
Thanks, many thanks, Professor Arthur. So powerful, inspiring words. So now we just have space for your final comments and your final words. And many, many thanks again.
I think there needs to be more writing about lived experience. And that's what I'm doing in my writing on race. Lived experience is so important because I can see at my age that the social science textbooks and the humanities writings do not tell the story. Some people think they tell the story, but they miss so much of the texture of growing up Black in particular places where I grew up, where other Black people grew up. And I always take into account there are many hierarchies of oppression. There's a racial hierarchy of oppression. There's a gender hierarchy of oppression. There's a sexuality hierarchy of oppression, a religious hierarchy of oppression. And within those hierarchies, there are hierarchies. Within the racial hierarchy of oppression, there is skin color oppression, because there is a body of research that shows that in all of the countries where you have different colored people, the lighter skinned ones, take the United States, take Brazil, even if you are a Black person in Brazil, but a lighter skinned Black person, you have better life outcomes statistically than those who are darker skinned. So going back to my example before, I can say I deserve 2 awards. I deserve an award for accomplishing what I have accomplished being an African American, and I deserve a second award for accomplishing that being a dark-skinned African American. Okay, a lot of people don't know about the skin color element in white supremacy, but it's crucial. It's crucial. And I study that, I know it, I've seen the statistics. Basically, light-skinned people in a group, and this is Mexicans in the US, this is people in India, it's all over, are twice as well off as their dark-skinned counterparts. And whites are basically twice as well off as their light-skinned counterparts of color. Okay. So I'll leave you with those comments. And thank you for inviting me. I've had a great time talking. I hope you had a great time listening. Okay. So shall we close it off? Okay. Thanks. Bye-bye. Hope to see you again.
Thank you very much, Professor Arthur. That was fascinating. That was